You ever romanticized the Middle Ages? Dreamed of wearing a suit of armor, walking through castle halls with banners flying and minstrels playing? Maybe imagining yourself as a noble knight or a princess in a tower? Yeah, most people have. But here's the truth: if you, a modern human with your coffee habits and hot showers and hand sanitizer, were dropped into the Middle Ages, you'd last about as long as it takes a rat to die in a plague-ridden alley. Not because you're weak, but because life back then was unimaginably harsh in every possible way. We've idealized an era that was, in reality, a symphony of suffering, a slow, grinding nightmare painted over by history books and Hollywood screens. Let's strip away the fantasy and talk about the real Middle Ages, the dirt, the disease, the desperation, and why you, and honestly most of us, wouldn't make it past breakfast. Because this isn't just about discomfort, it's about survival. In a world that didn't care if you were tired, in pain, or just wanted clean water. It's about waking up on a bed of hay with lice crawling on your scalp, having a bowl of spoiled stew for breakfast, then working 16 hours in mud and filth until your hands blister and your back screams. And if you're lucky, maybe no one accuses you of being a witch that day. Maybe this video is not about glorifying suffering. It's about appreciating just how far we've come and how close we always were to the edge of extinction. This is a world where one infection could end you, one bite of bread could poison you, and one false accusation could see you tortured in front of a crowd, cheering like it's a soccer match. This isn't a game, it's history, and it's brutal. You wouldn't last 24 hours, and by the end of this journey, you'll understand why. 1. Food and drink were disgusting and dangerous. Commoners ate bland, repetitive meals like pottage, watery vegetable stew. Bread often contained stone chips and ergot, a toxic fungus that caused hallucinations and death. Meat was rare, and often rotten. Spices were used to mask decay. Drinking water was unsafe. Everyone drank weak beer, including children. Before you even think about braving the diseases or torture devices. Let's start with the one thing you'd need just to make it to lunchtime: food. And no, we're not talking about turkey legs and goblets of wine served on golden platters. That's fiction. The real menu was more like a punishment than a meal. Imagine waking up starving, only to find your breakfast is a bowl of potager-thin, watery sludge made from old vegetables and maybe, if you're lucky, a bit of barley or beans. It's been simmering over a fire for days, absorbing everything, from ash to insect carcasses. That's not flavor, that's survival. And let's talk about bread. You might be thinking of the soft golden loaves you get at your local bakery, but in the Middle Ages, bread was more like edible gravel. It was dense, dark, and made from flour ground between stone, wheelstone, that often chipped and ended up in the dough. Every bite could grind your teeth down a little more. Medieval dentists didn't exist. Toothaches were eternal. Now, here's the part that might actually kill you. Much of the bread, especially rye bread, was laced with ergot, a toxic fungus that could cause violent hallucinations, convulsions, gangrene, or death. Whole villages tripped simultaneously, thinking the devil was among them, when in reality their baker just didn't inspect the flour. You might accuse your neighbor of being a witch, but the real monster was in your meal. And if you thought you could chase down this horror show with a glass of water, think again. Drinking water in most towns was a guaranteed way to catch dysentery, typhoid, or worse. Rivers and wells were often contaminated with human waste, animal carcasses, and industrial byproducts like tanning chemicals. The solution: ale, weak, often cloudy beer that was safer than water because the brewing process killed germs. Children as young as 5 drank it with every meal, not because it was fun, because it was safer than dying of dehydration. Meat, that was for the rich, and even when you got it, it was probably starting to rot. Without refrigeration, preservation meant heavy salting or drying if you couldn't afford spices to mask the spoilage. You just pinched your nose and chewed fast. The 5-second rule. In medieval times, it was more like the 5-day rule. And don't even think about sushi. Fish, for most inland folks, was delivered days or weeks after it was caught, preserved only by salt and prayer. The smell alone could make you retch, but if you were hungry, you ate it anyway. There was no DoorDash, no second option, and no food safety inspections. Every bite was a gamble. If you managed to keep this toxic buffet down, you still had to deal with the aftermath. And that's a horror story of its own. 2. Sanitation was primitive and repulsive. Toilets were chamber pots emptied into streets. Castles used garderobes, holes in stone seats. Waste disposal was handled by gong farmers, who were highly paid but socially shunned. No toilet. Paper people used leaves, hands, or cloth scraps. Cities smelled horrendous from human waste, dead animals, and pollution. Let's say you've survived the breakfast stew of death and the gritty bread of doom. What's next? Nature calls, and that's when things get really medieval. Forget porcelain toilets, flush handles, and air fresheners in the Middle Ages. Your bathroom was either a wooden bowl under your bed, a hole in a bench, or the street outside your window. Literally, chamber pots were the standard in most homes, just big bowls or buckets that everyone in the house used, then emptied, usually by hurling the contents out the window. No joke, you'd just shout, "Garde l'eau," from the French garde à l'eau, or watch out for the water, and hope no one was walking below when gravity took over in cities, the ground level. Streets ran with a slurry of human waste, animal offal, and rotting garbage. The stench was inescapable, sticking to your clothes, your skin, your very soul. Forget your scented candles dry, living downwind from an open sewer. If you were rich enough to visit a castle, you might find a gardobo, which was basically a hole in a stone slab that dropped waste directly down the outer wall into the moat or a pit. If that sounds better, remember, those moats weren't full of sparkling water, they were cesspools of disease. But the real heroes or victims of medieval sanitation were the gong farmers. These poor souls were paid to collect human waste from cesspits and latrines and carry it outside city walls. They could only work at night because the smell was so horrific. They were banned from appearing in public during the day. Even if they were paid 4 times the average laborer's wage, they were the most despised members of society. Imagine smelling so bad that even the peasants looked down on you. And if you're wondering what about toilet paper, there wasn't. Any leaves, moss, straw, or even your own hand were the tools of the trade. The left hand, specifically, which is why shaking hands with your right became a cultural norm in many places. And if you were rich, maybe a bit of wool or linen, but even that was rare. Bathing, well, that's where things go from gross to myth-busting. Yes, the cliché that people didn't bathe is partly true, but not because they liked being dirty. They feared that bathing opened the skin's pores and let disease enter the body. So many people would go months without washing. Lice were everywhere. Special combs to remove them were everyday items. Head tuto infestations. Just another Tuesday. Now imagine. You're covered in sweat from a full day of field labor. sleeping next to your entire family in a one-room hut, and haven't bathed since spring. You're not just surviving filth, you're marinating in it, and yet this was normal. This was life. You'd either adapt or your immune system would give out by your second week. 3. Life was grueling and short. Most people were peasants or laborers, working dawn to dusk for survival wages. Trades were toxic. Blacksmiths inhaled fumes. Tanners worked with urine. Kids started apprenticeships at age 7. Diets were poor, leading to extreme caloric burn and exhaustion. Life expectancy was 30 to 40 years. Child mortality was high. So now you've eaten what might have been poisoned bread, stepped through rivers of human waste, and gone 3 months without a bath. Still with me? Good, because the next part of surviving medieval life is the part that breaks you slowly, relentlessly. The work there was no such thing as a weekend, no PTO, no lunch breaks. The concept of work-life balance was laughable because your entire life was work. From sunrise to sunset, day in and day out, whether you were sick, injured, or just plain exhausted, you worked. Because if you didn't eat. And if you didn't eat, you died. Simple math, most people were peasants, more than 90% of the population living on land they didn't own, working fields that fed someone else. You rose with the sun and labored until darkness took away what little visibility you had. Wooden plows, hand-sown seeds, harvests done with curved iron sickles that shredded your hands. No gloves, no machines, no safety nets, just your back, your calluses, and your will to keep pushing through. During harvest season, the days were even longer. 16 hours under the hot sun, no sunscreen, no shade, burning through over 4,000 calories per day just to stay standing. If your body failed, there was no no workers' comp. You simply stopped, and no one stopped with you. And let's say you weren't a farmer, let's say you were a tradesman, a blacksmith, maybe. Sounds cool, right? Until you realize you're standing in a smoky forge for 12 hours, inhaling toxic fumes and risking third-degree burns with every swing of your hammer. Or a tanner, someone who turns animal hides into leather. That job required working with urine and lime, soaking skins in vats of filth until your hands and face permanently reeked of decay. Your skin turned yellow, your clothes rotted on your body, and you were marked by smell alone. And you didn't get to choose this life. Not really. If you were born to a blacksmith, you became one. If your family worked the land, so did you. The only career counseling you got was survival. If you could lift heavy things, you worked. If you couldn't, you starved. Worse yet, trades often began with childhood. At 7 years old, you were shipped off to live with a master craftsman as an apprentice. No family, no games, just work. 6, sometimes 7 days a week, for up to 14 years. And maybe if you didn't die, get maimed, or go blind, you became a journeyman. But most never did. And don't even think about begging. That wasn't noble, it was a last resort. Children became link boys, carrying flaming torches to light the way for nobles. Others, called pure finders, collected dog feces and sold it to tanners. Yes, that was an actual job. Wages, barely enough to live. A day laborer might earn 1 or 2 pennies a day, enough for a couple loaves of rock-like bread and nothing more. Minimum wage wasn't a debate, it didn't exist. The only question was, what's the minimum you need so you don't drop dead before tomorrow? Your body wore out fast. Joints failed early. Hands turned arthritic. You weren't expected to live past 40 and, by 30, you already felt 70. There were no vitamins, no gym recovery days, no massages. You broke, and you kept going. Or you didn't, and the world moved on without you. 4. Medicine was primitive and deadly. Diseases were blamed on bad air or imbalanced humors. Treatments included bloodletting, leeches, and mercury. Doctors prescribed remedies that were often worse than the disease. Sanitation and hygiene were non-existent, making infection and plague rampant. Now let's imagine your luck just ran out. Maybe you caught something from that spoiled stew, or the moldy bread, or the fact that no one including you has washed their hands since last spring. Your head aches, your body burns, your throat closes, and your skin feels like it's peeling from the inside out. Today, we'd call it a virus. Back then, they'd call it bad air, divine punishment, or worser, demonic possession. Congratulations, you're now a medical mystery in a world with no real medicine. There were no antibiotics, no sterilized instruments, no understanding of germs. Disease was interpreted through a concept called the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Too much of one. You were sick. The cure: bleed it out, and bleed they did. Bloodletting was the go-to treatment for everything from headaches to infections to broken bones. A doctor would slice open a vein and let your lifeblood pour into a bowl while you lay there, weakening by the second. The idea wasn't healing, it was balancing. If you died, well, you were too far gone. If you lived, they'd pat themselves on the back and tell the next patient, "See, it works." Then there were the leeches. Dozens of them. Slapped onto your skin, they latched and sucked until they were engorged with blood and your body was weak enough to pass out. One 15th century text recommended 70 leeches for certain conditions. 70. That's not treatment. That's a horror film, fever, time to make a poultice of dung and herbs. Skin disease. Try mercury S. The toxic metal we now know causes neurological damage. Syphilis, mercury again. Because if the disease didn't kill you, the treatment would. And let's not forget dentistry. No Novocaines, no clean tools. If a tooth rotted, and it often did because sugar wasn't needed to ruin your teeth. When your bread doubled as sandpaper, there was one solution: yank it out with pliers, while 3 other people held you down. If you screamed loud enough, the entire village knew it was your turn at the dentist. The scariest part, even the healers didn't know how dangerous they were. Their robes, their blood-stained aprons, their unwashed hands, these were symbols of authority. But behind the curtain, they were winging it. Most medical knowledge came from ancient Roman texts that hadn't been updated in over 1,000 years. Many remedies were based on astrology, moon phases, or the dreams of madmen. Worse yet, disease wasn't just deadly, it was routine. Infant mortality rates were staggering. Roughly 30% of children died before reaching age 5. The average lifespan hovered between 30 and 40 years. And that was if you didn't die from plague, war, childbirth, or execution. The bubonic plague alone wiped out half of Europe in the 14th century. Imagine waking up one morning, seeing black boils on your skin, and realizing your village would be silent by nightfall. No explanation, no escape, just death. And in the rare case that you did survive, no follow-up, no rehab, no healing spa. You just went back to work, weaker, slower, and more likely to die next time. Because the only guarantee was this: in the Middle Ages, You were always one fever away from the end. 5. Justice was brutal and arbitrary. No standardized laws. Punishment was harsh and often public. Trials relied on superstition, trial by fire or water. Common punishments: mutilation, hanging, drawing and quartering, torture. The poor had no legal defense. Nobles often escaped justice via trial by combat or payments. Imagine waking up in medieval Europe and someone's banging on your door. You're being accused of theft or witchcraft or maybe just bad vibes. The truth, it doesn't matter, because justice in the Middle Ages wasn't about truth. It was about survival and pain. A lot of pain. Forget lawyers, forget evidence, forget innocent until proven guilty. In the Middle Ages, guilt was assumed and the trial was just a formal excuse to make you suffer until you confessed. Legal systems varied wildly from one town to the next. What was legal in one village might get you tortured in another, just 5 miles away. There were no standardized codes, no trained judges, no public defenders. Your fate might be decided by a priest, a lord, or a crowd of villagers with pitchforks and bad tempers. Let's say you were accused of stealing. The punishment wasn't a fine. It wasn't community service. It was mutilation, a hand chopped off, a brand burned into your flesh. In England alone, over 200 offences could get you executed, including cutting down a tree in the king's forest or stealing something worth more than 12 pence. That's the price of a small loaf of bread. You were starving. Too bad. The gallows. Didn't care. And then came the ordeals. Trial by fire. Trial by water. Trial by pain. One common test: carrying a red-hot iron bar for 9 feet, then wrapping your burned hand in cloth for 3 days. If it healed cleanly, you were innocent. If it got infected, which of course it did, you were guilty. Another test: trial by water. You were tied up and thrown into a river. If you floated, the water had rejected you and you were guilty. If you sank, you were innocent, but now you are also dead. Justice by drowning. If God wanted to save you, he'd intervene. If he didn't, well, the system worked, right, and execution. It wasn't just punishment, it was entertainment. People brought food, their children, their neighbors. Public hangings drew massive crowds, but hanging was merciful compared to the alternative. Drawing and quartering. That meant you were dragged behind a horse, hanged until almost dead, disemboweled while still alive, beheaded, then chopped into 4 parts. It wasn't just meant to kill you, it was meant to make a statement. Meanwhile, the wealthy played by different rules. Nobles could demand trial by combat, hiring professional fighters to battle on their behalf. If their champion won, they were innocent, regardless of the crime. The poor had no such luxury. If you couldn't pay someone to bleed for you, you bled. Nobles could also pay blood money, a fine, to the victim's family to avoid punishment. Altogether, justice wasn't blind. It was bought. Torture wasn't rare, it was standard practice. Devices like the rack stretched your limbs until joints popped out of sockets. The Iron Maiden enclosed you in a spiked coffin. Thumbscrews crushed your fingers until you screamed. And here's the kicker: torture was used before trial to extract a confession. So whether you were guilty or not, you were going to admit to something just to make the pain stop. And once you confessed, there was no appeal. Only execution. And prisons, they weren't designed for punishment. They were just holding pens, dark, filthy dungeons where you sat, often chained to a wall, until your trial or execution date. The state didn't feed you. You relied on friends or family to bring food. If they didn't, you starved, innocent or not. Even humiliation was weaponized. Locked in stocks in the town square, you'd have rotten food, mud, and feces thrown at your face. Women who argued too much were strapped into ducking stools and dunked underwater repeatedly until they shut up. Board didn't come back up, and if you thought police were the answer, think again. There were no professional police forces, just elderly night watchmen too frail for regular work, and mobs who acted on rumors. All it took was one neighbor pointing a finger, and your life could spiral into pain, torture, and death in the Middle Ages. Justice wasn't a path to fairness. It was a test to see how long you could suffer before you broke. 6. Warfare was constant and catastrophic. Wars were frequent, for example, 100 Years' War. Only wealthy knights had full armor. Most soldiers wore cloth and used farm tools. Battles were chaotic, deadly, and followed by famine, pillaging, and sieges. Disease killed more soldiers than combat. Forget the polished images of gallant knights charging across open fields, banners flying in the wind, lances clashing under noble sunlight. That fantasy belongs in fairy tales and overpriced video games. Real medieval warfare wasn't glorious, it wasn't clean. And if you were unlucky enough to be anywhere near a battlefield, whether as a soldier or a civilian, it meant you were one breath away from agony, mutilation, or death. Usually all three. Let's start with the basics. Medieval Europe was almost constantly at war. From territorial squabbles between dukes to century-long conflicts like the 100 Years' War. Violence wasn't a rare occurrence, it was a lifestyle. If you were born male, you either fought, supported those who fought, or ran from those who fought. Peace was the exception, not the norm. But who got the good armor? Not you, unless you were a wealthy noble, the closest thing you had to protection. It was a padded cloth called a gambeson. If you were lucky, it had a few metal plates stitched into it. If you were really lucky, you might have a rusted helmet that didn't block your vision or cave in when hit with a mace. As for the full suits of shining plate armor, those were the medieval equivalent of a Lamborghini, ridiculously expensive, hard to maintain, and only for showy rich men with something to prove. Weapons weren't elegant, either. A sword was a luxury. Most soldiers used sharpened farming tools, seeths, pitchforks, hammers. The longbow was a feared weapon, not because it was beautiful, but because it was deadly. It could pierce armor at 200 yards and was wielded by men whose skeletons permanently deformed from years of drawing 200-pound bows. These weren't just warriors, they were weapons themselves. Battlefields weren't neat lines of men marching in time. They were chaotic meat grinders. Screams, blood, severed limbs, choking smoke, mud thick with corpses. There were no medics, no ambulances, no clean bandages. If you got wounded and didn't die on the spot, you either bled out slowly or succumbed to infection in the days that followed. Tetanus, gangrene, sepsis, these weren't terms people knew. They were just the rot or the fever, and they were death sentences. And yet, as brutal as the battles were, they weren't even the worst part. It was what happened in between. Armies lived off the land, which meant they took everything. If you were a villager in their path, it didn't matter whose side they were on. They'd raid your home, burn your crops, slaughter your livestock, and move on. Famine followed war like a shadow, and where food vanished, so did morality. Soldiers would rape, pillage, and destroy from leaving entire villages in ruin. Sieges were especially horrific. If an army surrounded your castle or walled town, they didn't storm the gates right away. They waited for weeks, months, sometimes years. You sat inside with dwindling food supplies, drinking rainwater from buckets and eating whatever you could scavenge: cats, rats, leather belts. People, yes, there are recorded cases of cannibalism during medieval sieges. You didn't die fighting. You died starving. And if you surrendered, sometimes that was even worse. Captors might torture you, enslave you, or use you as an example for the next town. Heads on spikes weren't metaphors, they were medieval road signs that said, "Obey," or "This is you." For women and children, war was a sentence without a crime. There were no protections, no safe zones. If a castle fell, the victors would rape and enslave. Entire generations were traumatized in a single day, and there was no therapist to call. Afterward, just silence and survival. The real truth about medieval war. It wasn't about honor. It wasn't about strategy. It was about enduring hell and hoping the next swing didn't land on your neck. Even the winners limped home with disease, trauma, and infected wounds. There were no medals, no victory parades, just graves and ghosts. 7. Daily life was miserable. Cities stank of waste and rot. People rarely bathed. Lice were normal, and clothes were few and uncomfortable. Overcrowded homes lacked privacy. Families and even strangers shared beds. Social mobility was nearly impossible under the feudal system. Let's say you survived your first day of work, avoided the courtroom torture circus, and narrowly dodged conscription into a war you don't understand. You're starving, blistered, and exhausted, but now it's finally time to go home. Right? Get some rest. Take a shower. Crawl into your cozy bed and scroll through cat videos. Except none of that exists. Not the shower, not the bed, and definitely not the cat videos. What does exist is a hut. A single-room shack built from timber, mud, and straw, with one door. Maybe a tiny window and a roof that leaks if it rains. For longer than 5 minutes. You don't live here alone. Your parents, siblings, and sometimes even your animals live here too. Privacy, not a concept. You eat, sleep, and relieve yourself within feet of each other. If someone snores, gets sick, or starts dying, you all hear it. You all smell it. And smell was unavoidable. You don't notice how clean your modern life is until you learn that in medieval towns, people carried herbs in pouches just to mask the ever-present stench of death and waste. Streets were lined with garbage, human feces, and rotting meat. Butchers dumped entrails right outside their shops. Slaughterhouse runoff mixed with sewage in the open drains. Imagine walking to work every morning with your boots squelching in. Filth and the air thick with the scent of decay. Hygiene. That's a cruel joke. Bathing was rare not because water was scarce, but because people genuinely believed it was dangerous. The theory went, opening your pores through hot water allowed disease to seep in, so people didn't wash. Not weekly, not monthly, sometimes not for half a year. During those long, unwashed stretches, lice set up camp, not just on your scalp, on your clothes, your eyebrows, your eyelashes. Combs designed for removing lice were sold alongside spoons and bread knives. Fleas were everywhere. And if you were lucky enough to own more than one outfit, congratulations, you had two. Most people wore the same rough, itchy linen undergarments and wool tunics every day until they literally disintegrated. Shoes were paper-thin leather scraps that offered no protection against cold, wet ground. Frostbite wasn't a surprise. It was expected. Now let's talk about heat. There's no central heating. If your home had a fire pit, it was smoky, and the warmth barely reached the corners. Winters were brutal. Fingers cracked, toes went numb. You huddled together, not out of affection, but out of desperation. Summer wasn't much better. The stink intensified. The pests multiplied. The air turned thick with flies, sweat, and the scent of bodies baking in wool. Sleep. You didn't have a mattress, you had a sack of straw that smelled like mold and mice. No pillows, no sheets. You curled up next to your siblings, or even strangers if you were at an inn. Diseases spread fast in these close quarters. One cough, one fever, and the whole family might be coughing blood within a week. And don't expect silence. Towns were loud. Blacksmiths pounding iron, roosters crowing, dogs barking, babies crying, people yelling. You weren't lulled to sleep by rain or white noise. You collapsed into unconsciousness and prayed nothing bit you before morning. Even the air you breathed was against you. There were no air filters, no fans, no concept of clean oxygen. Smoke from cooking fires clung to your lungs. Mold grew on. DAMP walls. If you lived near a tannery or a butcher, the constant stench could coat your throat. In larger cities like London or Paris, the pollution from thousands of hearths, open sewage canals, and unregulated trades made every breath a gamble. There was no fresh start each morning, no shower to wash away yesterday. You woke up already filthy and started over. 8. Your place was fixed class, control, and the cage you couldn't see. So you've endured spoiled food, open sewers, a war-torn landscape, and a house that smells like a compost heap mated with a slaughterhouse. Maybe you think grit will save you, that if you work hard enough, rise early and stay humble, you'll climb the social ladder, earn some land, get a better life. That's adorable. But in the Middle Ages, social mobility wasn't just rare, it was practically illegal. You were born into a box, and you died in that same box. The entire system was rigged to keep you there. It was called feudalism, and it worked like this. Kings owned everything. They handed out land to nobles in exchange for loyalty. Those nobles gave bits of that land to knights who pledged to fight for them. And at the very bottom, the floor everyone stepped on, were the peasants. You didn't own your home, your tools, or even your own crops. You worked someone else's land and paid them for the privilege, often with most of your harvest, and it didn't matter how smart, brave, or hard-working you were. None of that changed the fact that you were, legally and socially, property. You couldn't just pack your things and move to a better job. You couldn't pursue a passion. You couldn't marry freely. You needed your lord's permission to do almost anything. Marry, leave, sell, learn, live. Freedom was a concept reserved for the people who already had it. Education, only if you were a noble or joined the clergy. For everyone else, literacy was a luxury, and knowledge was tightly controlled. The Bible, in Latin, books, hand-copied and chained to desks in monasteries. If you knew how to read, people assumed you were a priest, a wizard, or a threat. Critical thinking wasn't encouraged, was crushed under fear, superstition, and obedience, and the church. It was the only institution more powerful than the king. Priests decided what was moral, what was legal, and what was eternal damnation. They taxed you, judged you, married you, buried you, and if you dared challenge them, if you whispered the wrong thing or asked too many questions, you might find yourself excommunicated, imprisoned, or burned as a heretic. Even your job was inherited. Sons of blacksmiths became blacksmiths. Daughters of farmers became wives of other farmers. The idea of doing what you love wasn't just unrealistic, was laughable. The only people who got to dream big were the ones already sleeping, on feather beds with guards at their door. But here's the truly insidious part. This prison had no walls. The limits weren't enforced with chains, they were taught as truths. You didn't need guards when people policed themselves. When your entire village believed that this was the natural order, the divine plan, the will of the heavens. To challenge, it wasn't just rebellion, it was blasphemy. You were born knowing your place, not because you chose it, but because everyone else would remind you if you forgot. 9. Superstition replaced science. People believed in demons, witches, and astrology. Illnesses and natural events, like eclipses, sparked mass panic. Information spread slowly, and rumors shaped public opinion. By now, your skin itches with invisible lice, your stomach turns at the thought of salted fish, and your lungs wheeze from smoke you've been breathing since sunrise. And still somewhere in your modern brain, there's this tiny flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, if you could endure the filth, the war, the pain, the injustice, you could escape into something more meaningful, more beautiful. Maybe there was magic in the Middle Ages, romance, wonder, purpose, and there was. But it wasn't what you think. Medieval people lived in a world carved from superstition and half-remembered legends. Science wasn't. Just undeveloped, it was indistinguishable from myth. People believed in demons, witches, ghosts, dragons, not because they were naive, but because those were the only explanations they had. A child gets sick overnight. The devil must have touched them. The moon disappears during a lunar eclipse. The end of the world is beginning. Your cow stops producing milk. Your neighbor's probably a witch. No one could read the stars, so astrology filled the void. No one could explain mental illness, so demons got the blame. Superstition was not fringe. It was the framework for daily decisions. You didn't make a move without checking with your priest, your village elder, or your gut feeling about what spirits might be lurking nearby. This fear bled into every aspect of life. A bad harvest wasn't whether it was punishment. A stillborn baby wasn't biology, it was sin. A neighbor's misfortune could easily become your trial, because communal panic was a hair trigger away from mob violence. Entire towns would spiral into collective hysteria. People burned at the stake because someone sneezed during a sermon. No evidence needed, just fear. And that's the cruelest twist of it all. The mind was never free. You couldn't dream of stars when you were told heaven was only for the obedient. You couldn't question suffering when you were told it was God's will. The church didn't just shape your faith, shaped your reality. Even beauty had a cost. Art was sacred, but it was shackled to religious control. Music was angelic, but only if sanctioned by the church. Stories were told, but always wrapped in moral warnings. Fantasy existed, yes, but only the kind that reinforced the chains you were already wearing. And if you wanted to escape, to dream beyond the borders of what you could see, you had two choices: become a monk and lock yourself in a stone cell for the rest of your life, or die labeled a heretic, because the only people allowed to see beyond the veil were the ones who agreed not to speak of what they saw in the end. The greatest horror of medieval life wasn't death, disease, or war. It was the idea that your mind, your voice, your imagination were never really yours. You've made it, barely, through blood and bone, plague and poverty, trial and torture. You've crawled through 10 parts of medieval misery, and if there's still a tiny part of you that says, "But it was simpler back then," let's make something absolutely clear. Simple doesn't mean better. Simpler just meant fewer choices, less freedom, and a shorter, more brutal life. We fantasize about the past because memory is selective. We picture grand castles, but forget the reek of human waste flowing down the stairwells. We admire the knights' armor, but ignore the crushed bodies it left in its wake. We romanticize the gowns, the tournaments, the honor, the tradition, but that fantasy was reserved for the privileged few. Everyone else, they were too busy surviving. And that's the truth most stories leave out. History isn't just what happened, it's what happened to the people no one wrote about. The peasant girl who died in childbirth at 15. The boy pressed into war before his voice changed. The mother who lost 5 children before her own teeth rotted out. These weren't rare tragedies, they were daily routines. We say we admire their strength, and we should. But let's not confuse admiration with desire. You admire a firefighter who runs into a burning building. That doesn't mean you wish your house was on fire. And yet, in a world so advanced, so connected, we still hear people say, "I wish I'd been born in a different time." Really? Would you trade clean water, modern medicine, antibiotics, education, electricity, access to information, laws that mostly protect you, and the chance to reinvent your life for a mud-floored hut, lice, and the risk of being executed? For stealing bread, would you trade your right to think freely for fear of being burned as a heretic? Would you give up your autonomy so a feudal lord could decide who you married and when? Because that's what nostalgia forgets. It polishes history until the rust looks like gold. But the people who lived then, they would have killed for the things you complain about today. They would have fallen to their knees for a single hot shower, a slice of fresh bread without mold, a safe place to sleep without rats, a life expectancy longer than a Netflix subscription. Yes, modern life is hard, but not medieval hard. Your worst Monday wouldn't even register on the pain scale of the average 14th century peasant. So, no, you wouldn't last 24 hours in medieval times. Not because you're weak, but because you've evolved. Because you're used to living, not just surviving. And that's something to be proud of, not ashamed of. The next time someone says they were born in the wrong era, remind them, you weren't born Lati, were born lucky. The Middle Ages were not a fairy tale. They were a waking nightmare for the vast majority of people who lived them. The comforts, choices, and freedoms we enjoy today are not just conveniences, they are miracles, bought with the blood and suffering of those who came before us. Appreciate them, use them wisely, and never forget how far we've come.